The snow fell without sound, a thick, smothering blanket that erased the world. It buried the jagged peaks and softened the hard lines of the pines, creating a landscape of profound and merciless silence. In this white wilderness, Jasper moved like a ghost of the mountain itself, a hulking figure whose presence was announced only by the crunch of his boots and the plume of his breath. His hair and beard were long and tangled, frosted with ice, merging with the fur-lined hood of his heavy coat until it was hard to tell where man ended and animal began. He was a creature of this place, carved from its stone and tempered by its unforgiving cold. For 6 years the mountains had been his only companion, their silent indifference a welcome respite from the cacophony of a world he had willingly abandoned. His cabin, nestled in a protective crook of the granite slopes, was a fortress of solitude, its chimney a lone, defiant finger of smoke against the vast, empty sky. Every day was a rhythm of survival, checking the trap lines, felling timber, hauling water from the half-frozen creek. The sheer physical exertion kept the ghosts at bay, the ache in his muscles a more tangible pain than the one lodged deep in his chest. He hadn't spoken a word to another human soul in so long that the sound of his own voice felt like a foreign intrusion, a jarring note in the perfect silent symphony of the winter. The cold was a constant, seeping into his bones, but he had learned to live with it, to draw a strange comfort from its clean, sharp bite. It was honest, this cold. It made no promises it could not keep. It simply was. And in its brutal honesty, Jasper had found a semblance of peace, a quiet hardening of the heart that he mistook for strength. He was tracking the faint trail of a bull elk, his focus narrowed to the subtle depressions in the snow, when a color jarred his senses. It was a violent slash of crimson against the endless white, a color that had no place here, a color that spoke of blood or fire or something impossibly, dangerously alive. He stopped, his massive frame going utterly still. The elk was forgotten. He squinted, his eyes accustomed to picking out the subtle shades of gray and brown in the forest, now struggling to process the sheer audacity of this red. It was snagged on the low-hanging branch of a fir tree, a fragile stain against the overwhelming purity of the snow. He moved towards it with the cautious, deliberate tread of a predator, his hand resting on the handle of the large knife sheathed at his belt. He expected a kill, perhaps a wolf's bloody work, but as he drew closer, he saw it was not blood. It was fabric. Silk, he thought, though he hadn't felt its like in a lifetime. Beneath the branch, half buried in a drift, was a woman. She was small, impossibly so, and curled into a tight ball against the killing cold. Her face was pale as the snow itself, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing, and she was wearing a dress of the most brilliant, defiant red, its silk embroidered with golden thread that caught what little light the winter sun offered. A Chinese woman. Here, in his mountains. It was an impossibility, a fever dream spat out by the blizzard. His first instinct was a surge of raw irritation. She was a problem, a complication in his meticulously ordered world of solitude. She was a weakness, a chink in the armor he had spent years building. The mountain would claim her, as it claimed everything that was not strong enough to endure it. He could walk away. It would be easy. The snow would finish its work, and by morning she would be just another frozen mound, her vibrant color a temporary secret between him and the wilderness. He almost did it. He turned to go, the harsh logic of survival overriding the faint, forgotten whisper of something else. But he stopped. He looked back at the splash of red, at the delicate hand peeking out from the snow, its fingers curled as if reaching for a warmth that wasn't there. A deep, guttural sound, something between a sigh and a curse, escaped his lips. He knelt, his large body casting a shadow over her. He brushed the snow from her face, his gloved fingers clumsy against her cold skin. A faint, almost imperceptible puff of mist escaped her blue-tinged lips. She was alive. And in that moment, the choice was no longer his to make. The mountain had presented him with this fragile, impossible thing, and the part of him he thought long dead, the man who had once known duty and connection, would not let him leave her to die. With a final, resigned grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bird with broken wings. Her head lolled against his chest as he stood, her red dress a stark, bleeding wound against the muted browns and grays of his own worn furs. He began the long, slow trek back to his cabin, her life a fragile ember he now carried through the heart of the storm. The cabin was a pocket of warmth in the frozen world. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing with a deep, pulsating life. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and curing leather. It was a Spartan space, built for purpose, not comfort. A bed of thick furs lay in one corner, a rough-hewn table and a single chair stood in the center, and tools, axes, knives, traps, hung neatly on the walls, each in its proper place. It was the den of a solitary animal, every object reflecting the singular existence of its inhabitant. Jasper laid the woman down on the fur pile nearest the fire, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands, accustomed to the brutal work of survival, now tasked with a delicate, unfamiliar purpose. He stoked the fire, adding seasoned logs until flames licked greedily at the stones, casting dancing shadows across the small room. The heat began to fill the space, a tangible presence pushing back against the encroaching cold. He looked down at her. The red dress, though damp and stained, was a thing of intricate beauty, its high collar and delicate buttons utterly alien in this rough environment. He hesitated for a moment before carefully removing her thin, frozen slippers. Her feet were small and numb, the skin a pale, unhealthy white. He chafed them between his large, warm hands until a little color returned, then wrapped them in a dry piece of wool. He felt a profound sense of intrusion, of crossing a boundary he hadn't known existed. He was a man who lived by simple, hard rules, and this woman, in her silent vulnerability, broke all of them. He prepared a thin broth, simmering dried meat and wild roots in a pot over the fire. The familiar task calmed him, the rhythmic chop of his knife a comforting metronome against the rising unease in his chest. When the broth was ready, he ladled it into a wooden bowl. It was then that her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were unfocused, clouded with confusion. Then they landed on him, and the confusion curdled into pure, undiluted terror. She scrambled backwards, pressing herself against the log wall, a small, wounded sound escaping her throat. He saw himself through her eyes, a giant, bearded wild man looming over her in the firelight, his shadow a monstrous thing. He stopped, holding the bowl out as if in offering. "Easy," he said. The word was a rusty croak, the first he had spoken aloud in months. It felt foreign on his tongue, the vibration in his chest a shock. He knelt, placing the bowl on the floor a safe distance from her, and then retreated to the other side of the cabin, giving her space. He watched as she stared at the steaming bowl, then back at him, her gaze flickering with distrust. Hunger eventually won out over fear. With trembling hands she reached for the bowl, cradling it as if it were a precious treasure. She sipped the broth slowly, her eyes never leaving him, watching his every move. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty, peaceful silence of solitude, but a tense, charged thing, filled with unspoken questions and primal fear. He was no longer alone, and the realization settled in his gut with the weight of a stone. A blizzard descended upon the mountain, a furious white maelstrom that sealed the cabin off from the rest of the world. For 3 days the snow fell and the wind howled, a relentless assault that shook the very timbers of the small structure. Inside, a strange and fragile truce formed in the enforced proximity. Jasper fell back into his routines, the familiar tasks a bulwark against the unsettling presence of the woman. He split wood, mended a trap, sharpened his knives, his large hands moving with a practiced, hypnotic grace. He worked in silence, acutely aware of her every small movement, the rustle of the furs as she shifted, the soft intake of her breath. She, in turn, watched him, her initial terror slowly giving way to a wary curiosity. Her name, he learned, was Lynn. She offered it quietly one morning, her voice soft and melodic, a stark contrast to his own gravelly tones. He gave her his name in return, Jasper. The exchange felt monumental, a bridge built across the chasm of their different worlds. As her strength returned, she began to claim a small corner of the cabin as her own. She moved with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, tidying the space with an efficiency that surprised him. She folded his spare furs, swept the hearth with a makeshift broom of pine needles, and organized his meager collection of pots and utensils. He found himself watching her, fascinated by the way her small, deft hands brought a subtle order to his chaotic existence. One afternoon, he noticed her mending a tear in his heavy winter coat, using a fine needle and thread she had produced from a small embroidered pouch she had kept clutched in her hand, even in the snow. The stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of delicate precision on the rough, worn fabric. He had never considered mending the coat. He would have simply worn it until it fell apart. This small act of care was a language he barely understood, yet it resonated somewhere deep inside him. The true shift came on the third night of the storm. He returned from checking the integrity of the roof, shaking a thick layer of snow from his coat, to a smell that stopped him in his tracks. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke and boiled meat. It was something else, something warm and fragrant and utterly foreign. Lynn was by the fire, stirring the pot. She had taken his rations of dried venison and root vegetables and transformed them, adding a pinch of dried spices from her pouch. She served him a bowl without a word, her eyes cast down. He took it, sat in his usual spot, and ate. The flavor was complex and warming, a ghost of a life he could not imagine. It was more than just food. It was a gesture, an offering. It was the first meal someone else had prepared for him in 6 years. He looked at her across the firelight, at the way the flames illuminated the elegant lines of her face, and felt the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a quiet, tentative thaw had begun. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world remade in crystalline white, sunlight glinting off the pristine snow with a blinding intensity. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than before. Jasper knew the fragile peace of their confinement was over. The world had returned, and with it, its dangers and its demands. He felt a strange reluctance to face it, a desire to remain sealed in this small, warm space with the quiet woman and the unfamiliar scent of her spices. But survival was a relentless master. He needed fresh meat. He took his rifle and set out, the cold air a familiar shock to his lungs. He moved through the snow-drowned forest with a renewed sense of purpose, but his senses were heightened, his awareness expanded beyond his own immediate needs. He was listening not just for game, but for anything out of place, any sign of human intrusion. It was near the ridge overlooking the southern pass that he found them. Tracks. Not the familiar prints of deer or elk, but the sharp, clear impressions of shod horses. 2 riders, by his estimation. They were recent, made since the blizzard had ended, and they were moving in a slow, searching pattern, circling the base of his mountain. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, settled in his stomach. These were not lost travelers. They were hunting. He abandoned his search for game and circled back towards the cabin, his movements swift and silent. He approached from the west, using the dense tree line for cover, his eyes scanning every shadow. The tracks came perilously close to the game trail that led to his creek, a mere 100 yards from his door. They were looking for something. Or someone. He burst back into the cabin, the heavy door slamming against the frame. Lynn jumped, her eyes wide with alarm at his abrupt entrance. The quiet rhythm of their morning was shattered. "Who is looking for you?" he demanded, his voice a low, harsh growl. The gentleness of the past few days was gone, replaced by the hardened edge of a man who knew the ugliness of the world. She stared at him, fear returning to her face. She shook her head, a small, helpless gesture. "No one." "Don't lie to me," he snarled, taking a step closer. "2 men on horseback, down by the pass. They aren't hunting deer." Tears welled in her eyes, and her composure finally crumbled. Through a series of halting phrases in broken English supplemented by gestures that spoke of desperation and fear, the story tumbled out. She had been brought from her homeland, sold into a marriage with an American, the cruel foreman of a distant mining camp. He had promised her family a better life. He had lied. Her husband had been a brute, but he had also been a thief, skimming gold from the company that employed him. He had died suddenly, a fever taking him in the night. His partners, the men on the horses, were convinced he had told her where he'd hidden his stolen fortune. They had given her an ultimatum. She had fled in the night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back. The red dress, she explained, her voice catching on a sob, was her wedding dress. It was the only thing of value she had left in the world. Jasper listened, the pieces clicking into place. The impossible woman in the impossible dress suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. She was not a mystery of the mountain. She was a refugee from the greed of men, and that greed had followed her right to his doorstep. The revelation settled over the small cabin like a shroud, smothering the fragile warmth that had begun to grow between them. The external threat was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, a purpose, and it was drawing closer. Jasper moved about the cabin with a tense, coiled energy, checking the latch on the door, peering through the small window, his hand never far from the rifle propped against the wall. The wilderness he could handle. Its dangers were honest, its rules clear. But the calculated malice of men was a different kind of predator, one he had come to these mountains to escape. He was no longer just a solitary man defending his territory. He was a guardian. The thought was both unsettling and strangely invigorating. Lynn sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The vibrant red of her dress seemed to mock the grim reality of their situation. She was a beacon, a signal fire for the men who hunted her. She finally broke the charged silence, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the tension like a knife. "They will kill you," she said, looking at his broad back, "for helping me." He turned slowly to face her. The firelight carved deep shadows into the rugged landscape of his face, making him look ancient and formidable. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. A flicker of something protective, something fierce and possessive, ignited within him. "Let them try," he rumbled, the words less a boast than a simple statement of intent, as immovable as the mountain itself. This cabin, this small patch of wilderness, was his. He had bled for it, frozen for it, surrendered his past for it, and now she was part of it. An unwelcome complication she may have been at first, but she was here now, under his roof, under his protection. The finality in his tone seemed to startle her. She looked at him, and for the first time the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, something softer, a nascent trust. She saw past the wild exterior, the sheer intimidating size of him, and glimpsed the unyielding core of the man beneath. Slowly, tentatively, she rose and walked towards him. She stopped just before him and reached out a hesitant hand, her small, delicate fingers coming to rest on his forearm. The touch was feather light, yet it sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. It was the first willing, gentle human contact he had felt in 6 years. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her dark, expressive eyes. The world outside, with its snow and its dangers, seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in the golden light of the fire. The chasm between them had narrowed to a single, breathtaking point of contact. They did not have to wait long. The next afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow, they came. 2 figures on horseback, materializing from the dense stands of pine like grim apparitions. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes fixed on the thin plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Jasper had been waiting. He watched them from the window, his jaw set in a hard line. He told Lynn to stay away from the door, to make no sound. He grabbed his rifle, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in his grip, and stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He stood on the small porch, his massive frame a formidable obstacle, blocking the entrance completely. He didn't raise the rifle, just held it loosely in one hand, its presence a clear and unambiguous statement. The 2 men dismounted, their movements confident, arrogant. They were hard-faced men with cold eyes, the kind who took what they wanted and crushed whatever stood in their way. "That's a cozy setup you got here," the taller one said, his voice laced with a sneering condescension. He had a long, thin scar that cut through one eyebrow. "We're looking for something that belongs to us." "Nothing here for you," Jasper replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, like the surface of a frozen lake. "Go back the way you came." The second man, shorter and stockier, laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound that grated on the stillness of the air. "We ain't leaving without the Chinese girl. We know she came this way. We'll even give you a share for your trouble. Just hand her over." Jasper's eyes narrowed. The casual, dismissive way they spoke of her, as if she were a piece of property, stoked the cold fire in his belly. "She ain't here." "Don't play dumb with us, mountain man," the scarred one snapped, his patience wearing thin. He took a step forward, his hand drifting towards the pistol holstered at his hip. "We saw the tracks. A little thing, wearing a red dress, hard to miss." He took another step, intending to push past Jasper and force his way inside. Jasper moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He didn't raise the rifle. He simply shot out a massive hand, planting it firmly in the center of the man's chest. It was like hitting a wall of solid oak. With a shove that seemed almost effortless, he sent the man stumbling backwards to land hard in a deep snowdrift. The man's partner instantly drew his pistol, but Jasper was already moving, closing the distance in 2 long strides. Inside, Lynn listened, her body rigid with terror. She heard the man's shout, the heavy thud as he hit the snow, and then the sickening crack of bone against bone. She pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The quiet sanctuary of the mountains had been breached, and the violence of the world they had both tried to escape was finally upon them. The clearing erupted into a scene of brutal, primal violence. The stocky man leveled his pistol, but Jasper was too close, too fast. He swung the butt of his rifle in a short, vicious arc, striking the man's wrist. A sharp crack echoed in the cold air, followed by a cry of pain as the pistol dropped into the snow. Jasper didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the trunk of a towering pine. The man's head hit the bark with a dull thud, and he slid down into the snow, stunned and gasping for air. The scarred man had scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage. He lunged at Jasper, a long knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was wiry and quick, but Jasper was a force of nature, a bear roused from hibernation. He met the man's charge not with finesse, but with raw, overwhelming power. He caught the man's knife hand in a grip of iron, twisting it until the man howled in agony and the blade fell from his numb fingers. Jasper spun him around, lifted him clear off the ground, and threw him bodily towards the tethered horses. The man landed in a heap, his bravado utterly shattered. Jasper stood between them, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling like a great bellows. He was a terrifying sight, his eyes blazing with a cold fury, the quiet mountain man transformed into an elemental force of destruction. He hadn't killed them, but he had broken them. Their bodies, their confidence, their will to fight. "Get on your horse," he commanded, his voice a low growl that promised far worse if they disobeyed. "Leave the guns, and if I ever see your faces on this mountain again, I will bury you on it." Scrambling and groaning, the two men helped each other onto a single horse. They cast one last, hate-filled look at the immense figure standing before the cabin, then spurred the animal into a clumsy retreat, disappearing back into the trees. Jasper watched them go, his fists still clenched, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the forest flooding back in, washing over the scene of violence. He finally turned and walked back to the cabin, his body aching, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his cheek where the knife had grazed him. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lynn was there, her face ashen. She rushed towards him, her eyes immediately finding the blood on his face and the raw, scraped skin on his knuckles. Without a word, she guided him to the chair by the fire and gently pushed him down. She dipped a clean cloth into the basin of warm water she kept by the hearth and began to carefully, tenderly clean the cut on his cheek. Her touch was a balm, a gentle counterpoint to the brutality he had just unleashed. As she worked, a single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. He reached up and caught her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The fury in his eyes had softened, replaced by an emotion he couldn't name. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick, raw. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet warmth of the cabin, her gentle touch on his skin, he knew he had not just been defending his home, he had been defending hers. In the days that followed the violent confrontation, a profound quiet settled over the cabin, different from any that had come before. It was not the silence of solitude, nor the silence of fear, but a deep, resonant peace. The external threat had been vanquished, and in its place a powerful, unspoken bond had been forged. The space, which had once been solely his, now felt shared. Her presence was woven into its very fabric, the scent of her herbs lingering in the air, the neat stack of mended clothes, the way she hummed a soft, unfamiliar melody as she tended the fire. They began to talk, truly talk, in the long, quiet evenings. The words came haltingly at first, like a long frozen river beginning to thaw. He told her about the life he had fled, a life in a crowded, clamoring city where betrayal had been disguised as friendship and noise had masqueraded as life. He spoke of why he had sought the silence, not out of hatred for the world, but out of a desperate need to find something real, something that could not lie. He didn't speak of his pain with self-pity, but with the detached air of a man describing a landscape he had long since passed through. He was simply stating facts, mapping the terrain of his own heart. Lynn, in turn, shared fragments of her own story. She spoke of the green, terraced hills of her village, the taste of the rain in the spring, the weight of her family's expectations. She painted a picture of a life that was both beautiful and confining, a world of tradition and duty that had ultimately led her here, to this impossible place. She never spoke of her dead husband with hatred, only with a profound and weary sadness, as if he were a storm she had been forced to endure. One night, as they sat watching the flames dance in the hearth, the firelight casting a warm golden glow on her face, she turned to him. Her dark eyes, which had held so much fear, now held a deep, contemplative stillness. "I haven't loved in 6 years," she said, her voice a soft, clear note in the quiet room. The confession hung in the air, simple, honest, and devastating. "My husband, the one they gave me to, he did not know the meaning of the word. He knew only ownership." Jasper's heart, a muscle he thought had atrophied from disuse, ached for her. He had no easy words of comfort, no hollow platitudes to offer. The world had been cruel to them both. Instead, he simply reached across the small space between them, his large, work-roughened hand covering hers where it rested on the fur blanket. Her fingers were warm. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a gesture of solidarity, of understanding. "The mountains are quiet," he said, his voice low and steady, "but they are not empty. Not anymore." She turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his, and in that simple, profound connection, a new kind of warmth spread through his chest, a gentle fire that had nothing to do with the roaring hearth. It was the slow, tentative blossoming of hope in the heart of a long and bitter winter. The world began to change. The sun lingered longer in the sky each day, its light gaining a strength and warmth that felt like a promise. The iron grip of winter started to loosen. Icicles hanging from the cabin's eaves wept steady tears during the day, and the deep, oppressive silence of the snow was broken by the cheerful gurgle of melting water. Patches of dark, rich earth began to appear on the sun-facing slopes, like wounds healing over on the white skin of the landscape. Life, dormant for so long, was stirring. Inside the cabin, a similar transformation was taking place. The atmosphere was lighter, filled with an easy companionship. They moved around each other in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, their lives intertwined. He would go out to hunt or chop wood, and the thought of returning to the warm, fire-lit cabin and the sight of her there waiting was a beacon that drew him home. She, in turn, had found a purpose in this wild place. She had a small collection of seeds she had carried with her, saved from her home, and she spent hours studying the soil in the clearing, searching for the perfect spot to plant a small garden. The question of her future, of what would happen when the mountain passes were clear enough for travel, remained unspoken between them. The thought of her leaving was a shadow in the back of Jasper's mind, a cold knot in his stomach that he refused to acknowledge. He could not imagine returning to the crushing solitude, to the empty silence. She had filled the spaces in his life he hadn't even known were hollow. One bright, clear afternoon he found her outside in the clearing. She had rolled up the sleeves of her red dress, now faded from wear and washing, and was on her knees, her hands deep in the dark, damp earth of a patch she had cleared near the cabin wall. She had a look of intense concentration on her face, a look of profound connection to the soil. He stood for a long moment, just watching her. She was a splash of impossible color against the browns and greens of the emerging spring, a vibrant flower taking root in the harshest of environments. She was no longer the fragile, half-frozen creature he had found in the snow. She was resilient, strong, and she was, he realized with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity, beautiful. The cabin behind her was no longer just his shelter. It was their home. The silence he had once craved was no longer a refuge from the world, but a shared peace. He walked over to her, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She looked up as he approached, shielding her eyes from the sun with a dirt-smeared hand. A smile touched her lips, a genuine, radiant smile that made his chest feel tight. He didn't need to ask if she was staying. He didn't need to voice the fear of her leaving or the desperate hope that she would not. He could see the answer in the way she looked at him, in the way her hands were rooted in the earth of his mountain. "The soil is good here," she said, her voice full of a simple, quiet contentment. "It is," he agreed, his own voice softer than he had ever heard it. He knelt down beside her in the dirt, the great mountain man and the woman in the red dress. He reached out and plunged his own large hands into the rich, dark earth next to hers. The spring had come, and together they were planting roots.